Formula 1 2023 is almost at a climax, and whilst the championships have been decided, there is so much to discuss when you dig into the data. So you're in the right place, because our data king, Break F1, aka Blake Hinsey, is joining us. Now, this is the second part of our in-depth data analysis. If you missed part 1, we'll put a link to that so you can check it out. Maybe you want to watch that first, or feel free to watch this one now. We're joined by our on-track reporter, Jon Noble, as well, as we break down the data and events that have happened this season. So, chaps, let me get into perhaps drawing a line in the season, maybe somewhere around Austria, and we're recording this just after Qatar, when everyone loses their minds about track limits. Were they not watching Austria? Recency bias and all that. But that was a point in the season when we saw some teams take an appreciable step forward and some fall back a little bit. Blake, can you explain what happened as that in-season development race really kicked off?
I think focusing quickly on one lap pace in terms of improvements, McLaren have had a 1% improvement, which is a world changer, from the back literally to the front. Mercedes and Haas have had small improvements. Alfa Romeo, Ferrari somewhat stagnated in terms of their gaps, but keep in mind, Ferrari have already been strong and they've been thereabouts at many events this season. But Alpine have dropped 0.5% off. Aston Martin have dropped 0.4% off, and then Williams not so great. But to be fair, if I look at these numbers the way I've cooked them, as a result of the second half of the season, Red Bull have dropped off if you include Singapore. But I think with a bit of context, we know that they have not really dropped off. They're still the benchmark. I would say my general thoughts on race pace are, we've seen a lot to do with racing. And I think in Monza, there was it's been a minute since Monza, so I've forgotten the order, but they were basically, teams can lose out by fighting each other quite a bit. And I totally get it. It's the thing of, do you let them race versus do you optimize the points for the team? What do we want to see? Do we want to see the show, or do we want to see the team shareholders' wallets getting fatter? I'd like to see a show every now and then, but on the other hand, if I'm running the team, I'm like, let the faster car through, build up the gap. But we've seen that quite a few times. Ferrari don't tend to go so well, and McLaren went from the beginning of the season, you'd see them have an okay qualifying result, and then you'd look at the race and you just see them falling back through the right field, and you're like, God, that's terrible. Now that is not the case. They are racing. Qatar was interesting. I think we want to talk about that later. Mercedes seemed to be able to do pretty well in the race. Like, their qualifying and race performances hand in hand. I think the problem, which is the context part of all this, is we can never tell how much the front runners are pace managing to get the most flexibility out of their strategies. And that's kind of the thing. It's like, how close then can they be? What did Max finish ahead of everybody in Japan? 20 plus seconds, 19? Like that's about where they're comfortable. Then we go to Qatar and it's like 3 seconds. Is this comfortable for them? Or is that, as a result of McLaren having spectacular pace, or is it something else? And I think it was the something else, or a couple of things. But realistically, I feel like race pace, we've got a lot of gaps and traffic and trains and people not exactly over to take cars outside of their pace order. Like, if you're outside of your pace order, your race pace is hidden a bit, if you're behind another car. But when you get the McLaren or the Mercedes in clean air, or the Ferrari in clean air, that's about where they are. And I don't think there's too many interesting things that I've noticed about race pace. That being said, I have not spent that much time, because actually I've seen a lot of charts that highlight race pace. And I think in order to get meaningful race pace out of the data, you have to go and do a lot of cherry picking the right stints that are meaningful and to put a lot of context on it, to the point of you could mishmash it however you want, is my gut feeling on race pace. But I think
there's also a quirk with these cars that you have to pick. Are you going for your single lap grid position on Saturday, or are you going for a setup that's a bit more benign and can look after the tyres on Sunday? Because they're still having the same problems of thermal management on Sundays. I think Red Bull have consistently said that their setup on Saturdays are compromised just because they focus on the races. I think Singapore was probably a good example of that. Completely messed up Saturday, looked a disaster, and then Sunday if Max had started on the front row there, he probably would have won.
Yeah.
And we see this. We see it with. Haas is perhaps the most extreme. Can clearly just switch the tyres on for qualifying, and will pop up in Q3, but was then almost guaranteed to finish 17th, 18th in the race just because the tyres get cooked and it disappears off. And this was McLaren's problem at the start of the year. It was a quick car on Saturdays. Even I remember Fred Vasseur in Japan when we were raving about McLaren pace and this fairy tale transformation. He went, nah. They qualified. Was it third or fourth in Barcelona, and Lando was up there, so he didn't buy into this thing. He just felt it was a team that had improved its race pace rather than a dramatic transformation. But Ferrari's had it's been quick on Saturdays all season. Leclerc, Sainz had poles. Leclerc would have had pole in, I think, was it Baku? And Miami, I think, grid penalties. So the car's been up there on Saturdays. Its main struggle was on Sundays. And that's the thing they've had to address all season, trying to understand and get a grip on why that car wasn't more consistent on Sundays. So I think it's quite hard to see, whatever way you look at it, Saturdays are compromised or Sundays are compromised, and it's hard to kind of plot. You can just make the stats say what you want. Basically.
That's my biggest complaint about people coming up with race pace numbers. I'm like, what did you use? Like, did you look at Friday data? Because like most of the time, it's just an important context to that. Teams, you're never looking at one event or one practice session in isolation. You're looking at here's what the team. You have a lot of information about temperatures, how hard you're pushing your fuel loads, and everything else, and then you're comparing that to what you know about free practice 2 to race offset at that track from a previous year compared to race offset for that compound on that type of track at another event. And it's a huge, massive database. And at the same time, you still see people getting it wrong, which means even the teams, they can have probably relatively more informed speculations than I can with some data because they have a bigger database and more experience about looking at that, but they're not getting it right every time. And you'll see people have massive fall-offs on Sunday because their predictions were incorrect. So I love it. I love the chaos.
Well, you mentioned teams getting it wrong. One of your videos this year that broke the internet was about when Red Bull had to work around perhaps a mistake that they made, proving they are fallible. Now, they did work around it, and you did find some incredible insights in the data. We kind of half mentioned it because we recorded this last show we did with you just after the Belgian race. Yep. And you hadn't fully dug into it, but then you put a video out, and it was fascinating to see how Red Bull were like, oh, we've messed up here, let's work around it. So they can be beaten. We've seen that this year, but also the team can have to work around problems. We want to look at next year though, and there is that recency bias, as you say, with McLaren, but is it possible to do a pecking order? I love that Lando was on the radio when he came second saying, Red Bull, we're coming for you, or words like that. I love that. It's fighting talk. Easier said than done. I'm sure everyone in Woking is, putting in the hours to try and do that. All the teams are, but try and, with that recency bias of McLaren doing so well, can we work out a pecking order and the chances of those teams catching up next year?
Yeah, I think right now what we're looking at, if you look at the last 3 or 4 races, you'll get a different answer than since Austria. But in terms of the second half of the season, if we split it now, like we've been doing before, it's still Red Bull. I think Ferrari's still outright on single lap pace is still there, but they do seem fallible. Like Qatar. Qatar's one of those also where you, in terms of representation of an average of a season, Qatar was not particularly representative. Qatar was pure chaos in terms of preparation, tires, improvement, preparation for some of the teams. But it's now for the second half of the season, as we split it, Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes, and then Aston have fallen way off in terms of single lap pace. And even on those races, Haas is doing better than Alpine at this point in terms of single lap pace. So it's like, ouch. It's a big struggle. Now I realistically think it's not crazy to say that McLaren could be challenging next season, but at the same time, I also see Ferrari and Mercedes next season as well being able. I'm already excited about next season, honestly, in terms of not only the technical aspect of seeing how things have unfolded, but the sporting aspect of watching hopefully some more race winners than just a couple. Fingers crossed, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, critical will be how much Ferrari and Mercedes have understood about the mistakes they made this year. And I think they both do. I think they've both learned an awful lot this season. With the way the current regs are, you're kind of hemmed in basically. Once you've got your major car wrong or your concept wrong, not very much you can do to rein it back. So you've got prospects there, and McLaren obviously a bit of momentum. But let's not forget, Red Bull's not just going to sit there and twiddle its thumbs all winter and roll out with a RB19B and not make a step. So its wind tunnel restriction ends, I think, later this month. So it's managed to weather not having that wind tunnel penalty. It's come through the other end of not needing to burn through it. Clearly understands this concept of car and what's needed very, very well. Minimal major upgrades this year, which says there's still plenty in its pocket if it was needed. So I think it's not an automatic given that the others will make a step. But I think we'll know. I spoke to James Allison. He did one of the Sunday Tech chats in Qatar, basically. He's always quite fearsome for journalists because you slip up one single element of your question and he'll pounce on it and try to that's a stupid question. But I said to him basically, how is it a question of he's going to take 4 or 5 races as a catch-up period to understand where your car is? When are you going to know? And he says basically, I think his quote was, most of the cars I've been lucky enough to be around while they've happened. The driver gets in on the first day of testing and doesn't exactly say spend your bonus, but they more or less do. So I think we'll know Bahrain test, day one, have McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari made the step that we need to give us a bit of a closer fight next year.
I love that when it's always that thing. You spend the entire winter, especially when you're in the race engineering and performance groups, you spend the entire winter, you get new wind tunnel maps in, you're getting new aero maps, you're going into the simulator, you're testing them, and the driver's like, yeah, it feels pretty good. And then the truth is, do you rock up to the test and is the car in the window or not? Because if the car's not in the window, it's either something simple or something very, very bad. And when it's one of those bad, you're getting to day 2 of the test and you're like, yeah, don't spend that bonus yet. So it's a bit like that.
I'm always intrigued to know the nerves there must be amongst all the teams on that night before the first test. Just that all that entire winter of work is done in almost isolation. I mean, I'm sure you get some indication of, you'll know if you've hit targets or not, but you can hit your targets beautifully and everyone else has done even better. So it must be horrible, that the nerves before that first test.
I think I was in the fortunate spot because, the race engineers and performance engineers are operational. You basically, you feed back, you help drive. Here's the interpretation of what's been going on. Here's where we can add performance. And then, that conversation gets had with other performance development groups like aero, suspension, and so on. And then you just run the car and you'd be like, I told you that wasn't it. You see the drivers do that sometimes. Like, I told you what we should have done with the car. It's not really like that. You're not throwing people under the bus, but you're just like, did we do everything right together or did we miss something? And it's nervy. It is nervy. But at the same time, I don't remember being nervous. I'm just like, is this thing going to be good this year? And there's some years where we rocked up with the Red Bull like, oh no, this is going to be a bad year, isn't it? Especially reliability, which we haven't seen too much of lately in the V6 era. So that's good.
Well, before we lose you, let's talk about the most recent Grand Prix as of when we're recording this, which was Qatar 2023. And there was a problem with the tyres. Now, plenty of speculation online, plenty of people accusing, I can't believe they had curbs that we didn't realise they were going to... None of that, of course, is true. It was all very well thought through, but there was a very specific set of circumstances. These racetracks are highly regulated that led to this issue with the Pirellis. Blake, can you explain a little bit more about what it's like working in a team when you come across these problems and actually what happened in Qatar as well?
Yeah, so long story short, I believe I'm fairly certain that Pirelli will often section tires because it's part of the development process. You're putting tires through stress, you're doing long runs on them, you'll cut them open and check them. And sure enough, Friday night, they found that they were not happy with some of the results. And the teams also supply Pirelli with all the data that they have, wheel speeds, loads. So Pirelli can say, here's the forces, here's the cambers and toes that were on these tires. Can we understand what was happening? And it looks like they pinpointed the 50 mil pyramid curbs on the exit of turn 12, 13, and 14. Now, I'm not clear on this, John or Martin. Do you guys know? Is that curb profile unique to Qatar?
No. So from what I understand, it's a curb profile that's used elsewhere.
Okay.
But I think that the difference in Qatar. Also, if we go back to the 2021 race at Qatar, there was a series of late punctures. From what I understand, is the Pirelli report submitted afterwards, kind of investigation, pinpointed the 50 millimeter curb being a problem. But back then, there was the first row of curbs was lower, and then the second row of curbs was 50 millimeter, and that was causing the problems. So it said, we've got a problem at this track because the way the curbs were abused with the 50 millimeter curbs. For some reason, I don't know whose fault it is, there was some communication breakdown. The Qatar revamp for this year resulted in these 50 millimeter curbs being the first layer of curbs, so basically all brought closer to the circuit. Then with this generation of cars, and I think particularly through 12, 13, 14, the duration, high G-forces, duration on the cars across the curbs, the fact they're kind of rolling over them, using them, abusing them, basically triggered the problem. So I think it's a combination of these curbs are probably perfectly fine at numerous tracks where cars don't abuse the track limits. But similar to Austria, really, there are certain corner profiles and certain layouts which force drivers to abuse curbs and run wide across them because it's the quickest way there is. So It's just one of these perfect storms of circumstance. It'll need changing for next year, whether it's a track limits issue or it's coming up with there must be some way to come up with a curb design that deters drivers from wanting to use them and it not being unsafe.
I think
it's not about pouring oil on the curbs and them being super loose, but there has to be in this day and age a curb design or concept that is perfectly suitable for acting as a deterrent for drivers without it impinging safety if something goes wrong.
Yeah, and I guess one of the other things, and I'm not an expert on track safety, but a lot of these FIA circuits, they have the compromise of making them not only safe for motorbikes, but also for cars. And then you have lots of compromises. So in some instances, I was thinking of the gravel-shaped curb is usually pretty good, but there's other implications for that for two-wheeled vehicles. So I don't think it's a straightforward answer, but the nature of that is pretty interesting because if you compare, let's say a 90 degree corner, straight in, and you exit at medium or low speed, and you kind of, touch these pyramid curbs for a second. That's one thing. Then you take 12, 13, 14 at Qatar, you're over 260 kilometers an hour. You're nearly full throttle, rolling over these curbs. You have lots of deformation in the tire. The tires don't stay, this rigid shape. They're completely rolled over on themselves. And then I think you start getting these, pyramid shapes at a super high rate of speed. The tire is slipping relative to the tarmac. The tire is sliding laterally, and you're beating this 50 millimeter profile at a point into the junction of the construction of the sidewall and the tread. That I don't feel like that's the kind of load case that they're like. I mean, because we got stronger sidewall junctions in Silverstone, didn't we? In anticipation of the load increases and development through the year, and we go to Qatar, and So
I think it's just an extreme. It's just an extreme layout of circumstance that doesn't exist anywhere else on the F1 calendar. And I think Mario Zola initially said that this type of problem never come up before, but he was corrected by one of his colleagues who said there was a gravel rally in 1998 where Pirelli tires had a problem of basically being the sidewall being pinched by the stones as the cars were going over and causing this tiny little sidewall separation. I mean, it wasn't a sidewall separation you could, stick your hand in. This was only seen on a microscope and absolutely tiny. And there's even an element of some suggestion that it may not even have been a problem because the tire life was so low, the wear rate was so high on the tires that by the time the problem emerged, actually the tire would have been no good to use for performance reasons anyway. So, it was better to play, err on the safe side and react and respond and say, "Oh, no, I'm sure it'll all be fine," because teams, the second they sense a bit of performance and will push the tyre to the limit, then they take it. I think, as Red Bull at Spa that year with the camber on the tyres that caused the hoo-ha on the Saturday night.
Yeah, I think honestly, all said and done, they managed this very well. It's one of the things you don't want to see. You've got a single supplier, and they managed it. We made adjustments to the track so that you got a track limit basically before you abused the curb, which some people decided to go up in the race and get 8 track limits and infringements on their own. But, I think it played out well, but I think it was also interesting to see what it did for race strategy. And for me, it was one of those things that's like, we had to basically 18 lap maximum stints is what it played out to be. And it's another thing to say, small tank refueling in Formula One. Did you like Qatar as a racing product?
I didn't. I thought it was just a race where it seemed drivers were just going around and pitting and then getting back on track, and there was some overtaking, and then the order shuffled around. There's one of those races where a lot happens but nothing happens, if that makes sense. And the McLaren, I mean, it was what Norris did to come through and Piastri to close down on Max was great, but there was no narrative through the race. It wasn't building through the race. You weren't thinking, this one stop is their opportunity to close up. It just kind of shuffled out and happened, and you weren't really clear who was racing each other. So I don't think to me, it didn't excite me. I didn't think it was a very good race at all.
No, and
it's too much.
Yeah, and not to be negative about it, it's just like one of those things. It's like, well, we've got that opportunity to see what that product looks like. Small tank refueling, not for me. You know how long you're going. And then another speculation that's been thrown about was, and I think this is a little bit more varied in terms of what it could play out like, but like forcing hard, medium, and soft during the race. But at the same time, it has a lot of the same aspects that this race had. You are basically forced to stop twice. You're forced to use 3 different tire compounds. So you kind of know what's going on. The soft tire, 8 to 10 laps. The medium tire, okay, a bit more. And I think the problem we've got right now with this set of tires is earlier in the season, you had hard and even sometimes medium tires that could do a whole race. That's, that's not excellent in terms of the racing product.
I would like to see this mandatory soft, medium, hard, just to see how it played out. Because the teams, I think I asked Mario Zola this earlier in the year, just how we had these boring races where the hard tyre would do all but one lap of the race. So in effect, there was no strategy about mandating it. So it has been discussed in the past. The teams always come back that eventually everyone will settle on the same strategy. But I just wonder if they would, because, even in Qatar at the weekend, when you knew all the mileage of all the tyres and the strategies, you still had, Merck attempted to put Lewis onto the soft at the beginning to just give him more of a tyre offset so we had 59 laps of tyre life for 57 laps if he didn't use a soft, so needed a bit of freedom. So there was variation there, and I think you would potentially get variation. So however much the teams always say, no, we'll all pick the same, I think when it comes down to it, they like rolling the dice and doing different things. But I think something needs to... A good 2-stop race is, I think the perfect way for Formula One. One stops with a hard tyre that is easily manageable. Doesn't particularly work. And the very, very worst races are when the hard tyre can do a long distance. We get an early safety car and the hard tyre is pushed a bit too far for comfortable. Everyone stops, everyone goes onto the hard, and then managing pace at 70% to get through to the end, and they just all drive around and do nothing. Yeah. They're the absolute worst.
Which leads us on...
Sorry, rant over.
No, it's good. Well, that leads us on to... I can't let you go before we talk about what we saw in Qatar, which was the McLarens finishing 4.8 seconds behind Max Verstappen over a Grand Prix distance. Great. Almost job done. Here we go. They're in the game. Not quite so fast, my friends. It's not as simple as that. I can't let you both go before we discuss that. The McLarens looked like they were doing... And they were quick on a single lap. A lot of qualifying laps, to use that phrase. It was a suboptimal strategy for Red Bull, so they were definitely compromised. And when Max was asked to go quicker, he could at one point. But before you go, Blake, what can you tell us about how we can't think that McLaren are 4.8 seconds behind Red Bull over a race?
I think Max made a really interesting point after the race, and it was clear. If you look at the fuel-corrected lap times, which is basically they've got about 105 to 110 kilos in the car. You know how much lap time a kilo of fuel costs, how much they're burning per lap. And you can say, right, correct these lap times. The first half of the race was somewhat pace managed. I know there was people were saying it was flat out. It was managed because you saw a couple of Max had a second a lap in several laps at the ends of stints. Like the tires were not done. Forcing the 18, 20 lap, whatever stints, you basically hide your tire advantage. And they were cautious on the first stop because if you push that too long and you stop early, you would end up on a 4 stop, which is terrible when it should be an easy 3 stop. So there's a bit of management. But Red Bull also had not a great stop, but even if you take 2 seconds off that stop, McLaren's 5 seconds behind at the end of the race is still quick. I think the tire life did not let Red Bull do what they could do, which was stretch these tires out more than their competitors. But at the same time, McLaren's performance, they did an exceptional job this weekend. So I think it's both those things coming together to make the gap look smaller.
I think what's important to say, it's not, I wouldn't read too much into the 4 or 5 seconds gap as being a sign that they've massively closed down. But what I think McLaren have done now is they've taken away Red Bull's comfort blanket at the end of races, of being able to cover for safety cars easily, being able to go for the extra fastest lap. So in a window now where they're not complete masters of their own destiny and just driving around and build up your safety car margin and pit when you want, and it's all easy peasy. I think they're now into a window where just slightly mindful of what the McLarens are doing, and if they can keep up this pace, I mean, it could open up opportunities that one badly timed safety car or a VSC, the right opportunity for McLaren, and they can get on them. Because Saturday, flat out sprint race, Piastri was there matching. Once Max was through, the pace was there. I mean, Max may well have had one eye on the championship and not, could have unleashed some more and risked everything. But I think it wasn't a case of the McLaren being slow. That car that weekend especially was very, very good.
Yeah, I agree completely. But like you said, it is now Red Bull do have to worry about safety cars and stuff like that, because that, McLaren having an advantageous safety car stop, job done. And then if they have 2 cars in that, then they can play the defensive game. And like we saw at the end of the race, Piastri and Norris were told to hold position and bring it home. And Lando he's like, "Are you sure?" And they're like, "Please." And they're like, "Okay, fine." They weren't taking any time out of each other like we saw with the Ferraris in Monza. They were literally both cooking all the way to the end of the race, whereas Max did not have room to breathe. They did not have time for another porous pit stop. That would have been Max coming out in the mix with them. So
what would have been interesting is where Mercedes would have played out if they hadn't messed up the first corner, because
Russell was quick.
Lewis on the softs, would probably have gone through, take the lead, pit early, and be on the offset that works really well for Bottas, for example.
Absolutely that.
So he could have been a factor. You wouldn't have known it watching the race, but he would have been a factor that emerges towards the end. And Russell's pace was fairly phenomenal throughout. He reckons they were quicker than the McLarens. So would have been fascinating to see how that would have played out in that three-way fight. But unfortunately, Turn 1 put pay to that.
Yeah, I agree with all that completely. I think Russell was there. And like you said, looking at the race now without that safety car, with Lewis being out of the race at the beginning, he did 8 laps on the soft, pit behind them. And then he just drives as everybody else pits around him and comes through and has a couple of cars to pass. That could have been quick for them. That could have been really quick, but unfortunately we didn't get to see that. But soon, I hope.
Excellent. Well, as always, thank you. Blake, where can our viewers and listeners find you online if they want to hear more about the content you make?
Basically, you can find me everywhere at Break with 3 R's. And then if you're into all this data stuff, break.com will take you over to all the nerdy, super deep dives including like lots of stuff that we've talked about here and a lot more visual detail, because I'm a visual learner, but we're on the audio platforms in the podcast today. But I think hopefully the producer will get a couple of these cool graphics in to help tell the story a little bit more so you can dig into it. But Break everywhere with 3 R's, and then break.com. And Jon and Martyn, thanks so much for having me on again. It's always a pleasure to chat with you guys. And I honestly learn so much every time we get to talk, because you guys have your finger on the pulse on the ground. You're having those conversations with the people, the track, and I think offering some really awesome insight and value to the listeners as well. So thanks again for having me and let me share the conversation with you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let us know in the comments below what you think about any of the things we've talked about today, because we love to have that conversation with you. We read all the comments and we love to see what's on your mind as well, the current state of Formula One and who you think could excel in 2024 and what you think about all the points that we have raised to date. Let us know, and we can't wait to hear what's on your mind. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, make sure you do. Usual stuff. Give us a thumbs up so we know you like this video, and we'll make more just like it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.